All right, welcome to our presentation on Death to the MVP. So I first want to start out by asking the question, how many of you came to this session literally because of the name? How many raise their hands? Like almost all of you guys, like 80% I would say. So that's awesome. Our marketing person did a good job. Way to go, John. So thank you for that. So today we're going to talk a little bit about Death to the MVP. But first, I want to give a little intro. So I'm Josh Barker, CEO of City Innovations. I've built 13 startups and 9 of them I've failed at. So I can't say I have a great track record because I've failed 9 different times, but I think that's pretty industry standard. 90% of startups fail, right? And after this failure, I look at my career as like a sine wave. So my career has a lot been, working at a startup and then recuperating in a larger company. And so worked at KPMG as a director of innovation for a while there before I went out to Silicon Valley for a period of time. So really I co-founded out there a fitness startup, believe it or not. But out there I like to say I learned how to learn. And that's really where my journey of City Innovations came, and that's where the company really started out of. So really we like to also say, how do you build the right thing? There's a difference between building the thing right and building the right thing. They're two sides of an important coin. But that's really what we like to focus on at City Innovations. And we're a venture studio, corporate venture studio out of the Grand Rapids area. So I'm gonna first talk about us as City Innovations for a second. So we focus on speed to first customer. And what that means is a lot of organizations, if you're talking about a custom software development company, really the output of their product is gonna be a beautifully finished, great user experience. They're gonna be developing an awesome product. For us, what we're focused on is how can you get that first customer and how can you collapse that time to first customer? And a lot of the talk is gonna be talking about that. It's how can you get the speed to get that first customer in your system? What I also want to talk about too is where we fit in terms of the market. So there's this nice graph of problem and solution. And I had this great conversation with this software development company, actually, Mike Marsiglia at Atomic Object here in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And one of the things that as we were talking is he said, Atomic's really good when the problem is very clear, it's more clearly defined, it's known, but maybe the solution's more unknown or unclear. And so for us, we like to play in that area where maybe the problem is unknown or unclear, or maybe the solution is unknown. So there's this big gray area we like to play in because we like to define and find new problems that are worth solving in the marketplace. So that's where City Innovations fits. So there's 2 aspects of our business. One is a product innovation studio. And so we work with corporations on really coming in as an agency and helping with their innovation process. So they might have a lot of ideas, they may have one idea, they may have no ideas, they may have already built and launched something. We meet them where they're at and help them really bring that to the next step. The other part of our business is really a corporate venture studio, and really one feeds the other. So when we're talking about our agency side, what we do is we really find those problems that are worth solving, and we find those really interesting problems in which our customers have 20, 30 years of experience in, and then we look to help them productize that, and what's more is even build a business around it. So that's really our corporate venture studio side. So who is this talk for? So let's get into the talk. So the talk is really, you can see here, there's a wide variety of people that would be doing it. So how many of you guys are corporate innovators? Okay, a couple in the room. Awesome. UX designers, UI designers, okay, a couple there. Product managers, yep. Startup founders, 1 startup founder. Great, we should talk after. Investors, okay, there are a couple investors. Entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs, okay, double raising hands, so maybe some overlap. And then growth marketers. Okay, sweet. There's like a couple of you there. So really this talk is for all you guys. I would consider you movers and shakers. Glad you guys are here. What is an MVP? So what is a minimum viable product? You get a wild variety of answers, right? So some people focus on the aesthetics, some people focus on the functionality aspect. There is a wide range of answers of what is design. Depends on who you ask, right? Is like, I just asked you guys who in this room is what role, right? We went through the different roles. You're gonna get a different answer depending on what role you are, right? So if you're an engineer, that has a very different answer, right? If you're a marketer versus if you're a product manager, UX designer. So it is a very different set of responses, as we'll see in a second. So what I will coalesce around is and say, really the most standard definition of what is an MVP is the first version of a product. So how many of you guys are engineers? Great, okay. There's probably 5 of you. So five of you guys as engineers, the first version of a product, have you seen these two triangles where you've got wrong way, right way? The wrong way is effectively saying, we're gonna build a small slice, and at the end of maybe a month, we're gonna come up with some code and some queries, and we're gonna be on our way to developing something, but it's really gonna take 6 months to build. And then there's the right way. People say, oh yeah, well, let's just slice it differently, and let's come up with some usable functionality for customers. And there's this debate, right? And we're almost arguing at Citi is that we need to change our definition, even this definition of the MVP, the first version of a product, and we'll get into a little bit of the reason why. So first version of a product. So I want to, before I do that, get into reasons why ventures fail, because there's a correlation between MVP and the reason why startups fail. So I mentioned at the beginning, 9 out of 10 ventures fail. And that's really because if you were to look on the right side, so this is a Gartner survey. It says no market need, ran out of cash, not the right team. But if you were to summarize all of these reasons, really it's we failed to build the right thing fast enough, right? And there's an element of speed that startups need because they're high paced, but they're high paced for a reason, right? They don't have the cash and the time to just be able to float around. And so an aspect of this is we focus too much time on building something that scales. And that's the argument, and that's the conversation I want to have today with all of you guys. So getting into this next slide, looks like the conversion messed up a little bit, but if you bear with me. So the $1.98 trillion every single year is wasted on failed ideas. And so I had to do some searching to gather all these statistics, but it's a pretty crazy figure. And if you compute that in man years, that's 4.76 million man years every single year. So I always like to say this is imagine, after you sit on this for a second, what our world would be like if startups are in this figure, corporations are in this figure, if we just increased that percentage of that success rate by just like 5%. That's a crazy figure, just 5-10%, just a small percent. And that's really what gets me up in the morning is being able to change that factor, because I believe the world, and I know the world would be such a better place if we can help startups and ventures succeed. So really, I kind of tricked you by coming here to this title because, sharing with you all of those statistics and saying we failed to build the right thing fast enough. In essence, what I'm saying is the normal pattern of building an MVP is usually a team takes 6 months to go out and build something, right? And so it's not even just death to the MVP. We want to kill the concept of what an MVP is. It's really death by the MVP, right? As teams actually struggle, that's why they die. They actually spend too much time building an MVP. I was talking to a startup the other day in the fitness space, which I had a lot to say because that was my startup out in the Valley. And we'll talk about my startup experience in just a second. But we were talking about their startup, and they literally, the poor guy came to me, and he's from the University of Chicago. I'm a mentor there. And he said to me, we just spent 6 months building an MVP. We're about ready to release it. What's your tips on how we can launch this to market successfully? And what I told him was I just said, I asked, after asking a bunch of questions of where they're at, my answer was like, I wouldn't use your MVP at all. I would throw it in the trash. And that's why we're talking today is death to the MVP. And I want to leave you on that cliffhanger because I do want to talk a little bit about why I would say that. So the fix to building this long process of a 6-month MVP, which is a pretty standard MVP for a SaaS-based product, if you're talking about building a digital product, is we want to kill the concept of that. And really at Citi Innovations, we've redefined that and defined a new term called minimum viable solution. And the reason we defined a new term, you have to be very careful in defining new terms for an industry. We defined a new term because of where we started in this conversation, which we started with what is an MVP. And what is an MVP has been such a loaded term that it's all things to all people. And so when we say minimum viable solution, really we want to focus on building to learn rather than building to scale. And so that's really important. I'm going to say that again, building to learn rather than building to scale. So that's intentionally doing things that do not scale, but help you learn as fast as possible. So our nature as humans is when we have an idea is we just want to go out and build something and construct it. And when we do that, we spend way too much time, way more time than we should, investing in making sure, saying how many times I've heard people say the first version needs to support 1 million users out of the gate because when we launch this thing, it's gonna be huge. And that's the furthest thing from the truth. The amount of times I've seen that in my career where they launch something and there's millions of users, is minuscule, right? I don't even know if I can recollect one or two instances in which that's true. And maybe if you're Elon Musk, that could be true. But if you're anyone else, that is just not the furthest thing from the truth. You have to build something that people truly want, and you really should just build things for a couple people. Don't build things for a million people. So minimum viable solution. So what I want to talk about is, I told you I'd talk to you about my startup out in the Valley. My startup out in the Valley was called Rallyall. An interesting thing about Rallyall is what we wanted to do was 66% of gym memberships go unused in the marketplace. And how many of you guys have gym memberships? Everyone. How many people actually go to the gym every day? Yeah, exactly. There's a huge discrepancy there. And some of you guys are even lying that you go to the gym every day. So that was the problem we wanted to solve. We wanted to solve the commitment issue. It's disgusting to us that the fitness space earns money off the fact that people don't want to commit to their goals and follow through with them. And so when we were out in the Valley, we were trying to solve that's a really hard problem to solve, right? And so the first thing we did is, like, my buddy called me up out of the blue. I was working at KPMG as a director of innovation. He's like, I got this idea. I just pitched it to an accredited investor out in the Valley, and he wrote me a check for $150,000. And he's like, can you come out to Silicon Valley and, like, help me build this thing? And I was like, well, I know that sounds like a lot of money. It's actually not. I'll help you figure out how to use it in the, on the side. So we were doing this as a side project, and then a couple months later, he called me back, and we thought we were talking about the project, and he just said, well, I raised over $1 million. Is that enough? And that was the moment that I was like, yep, that's enough. I can quit my job. So I quit my job at KPMG, went out to Silicon Valley for 3 years. And this is that process that I learned how to learn. And you can see here, the first thing we did, I made every classic mistake, is I took 6 months to build an MVP. And I just told you guys that is the anti-pattern of really what you want to do. And so it took 6 months to build an MVP. And so what we did is we built this immaculate system that was built to scale, not built to learn, built to scale. So we built it all on Amazon, highly scalable. It could literally support probably 1 million users. We had a great engineering team. They did phenomenal work. And my buddy was a social media influencer in the space, had over 1 million followers on social media. And we thought we were going to be sipping Mai Tais on the beach because we were like, oh, this is going to be great. We had 10,000 people sign up for one class. It was a Peloton, but for body weight exercises. This was 10, 15 years ago. And really when the market was ripe for this sort of thing. And so we thought it was going to be great. And we had 50 trainers. So when the day came for the class that had 10,000 people signed up for it, how many people do you think showed up? Someone said 100. 10 people. 10 people showed up. And so the first thing I thought of was like, oh crap, this is an engineering mistake. There must be some issue with some of our servers. And so the engineering team, I was helping on the engineering side. My background is actually engineering, and that I've defected to marketing, funny enough. And so we look on all the servers and things, and everything's fine. And I'm like, what the heck? And so my co-founder and I, the next week, we were just so puzzled. And we decided we're going to pick up the phone, because when they signed up, they had to give us their contact information, email address, phone number, and they had to check a box that said we could contact them. And so we reached out to them and we said, hey, tell me why, a lot of people didn't answer their phone. We had probably a good 10, 20 people that did. And they gave the standard excuses, fitness excuses, right? They were like, oh, I had to go walk my dog. Or I had to go help my grandma. She really needed help. Oh, I couldn't make it. I slept in. And so all these excuses. And we were like, oh my gosh. That was the moment we realized we built the wrong thing, right? And so, like I said, there's a difference between building the thing right, we built the thing right, and building the right thing. So we were really struggling, and with the concept of even throwing that work away, there's this fallacy of like, hey, we have to continue and march forward, right? Sunken cost. And so luckily, we didn't get sucked into that. And so what we did is we said we brought it back to the drawing board. We're like, well, what do we want to do about it? So then we put our heads together and spent 3 more months, built another MVP. But I want to bring this up that this pattern continued over the next 3 years. We first 6 months to build one, 3 months to build another. And it wasn't exactly like 3 months. We built, we had 13 different pivots roughly. So this kind of summarized a high level of the 3 years. But effectively, almost every single time we jumped down by at least 20 to 50%, shaved off the time to get to the next MVP. And so it was a fascinating journey to get from 6 months to 1 week. And so with this, I want to talk a little bit about that last pivot. I think it's worth talking about how we shrunk it down to a week. How did you do that? Like everyone's like, how did you build an MVP? That's why we reframed this as an MVS, a minimum viable solution. Because the end result of the last thing we did looked nothing like the initial version where we spent all this engineering work. We had a 5-person team and we had 2 or 3 vendors that were working on this thing. The last thing, what it looked like, was a group text. I'm not even kidding. It looked like a group text. So what we did is to solve the fitness challenge that I mentioned, 66% of gym memberships go unused. What we did is we brought it back to the team. It was about a 5-person team at that point. And a couple years, it was about 2.5 years in. And we just said, you know what? We've been banging our head against the wall. We learned about lean startup and learned about all these tactics. What if we were to just try an experiment? And we'll talk about lean startup in a minute. What if we just try an experiment and figure out what to build? And so in that time, what I came up with this idea is I said, what if I gamified fitness? And what if I first started out really simply with just creating 2 text groups of 5 people? We called it red versus blue when we first started, and basically gamified the fitness experience to where with these teams, I would release 60-second exercises throughout the day and about 6 or 7 of them each day. And they would get points for doing those exercises and get points for basically putting a picture or a video of them doing it as social proof to show that they did it. They'd get points for their exercises, same thing, photos and videos, extra points. And so we did this challenge to where every day they'd accumulate points. At the end of the day, the most amount of points out of each group, whichever had the most points, that group would win. And then the most amount of days won out of a week, they'd win the challenge. And so it was just a week challenge. We're like, just try it. So the crazy thing is I didn't think anything of it. I was having fun doing it. I was manually releasing these challenges. One text group, I would be in both groups, right? I'm the kind of the facilitator, moderator, releasing these challenges. And then at the end of the week, we presented our learnings to the group. And when I came time for mine, there was a bunch of other cool ideas that were there. Some were like, hey, we're going to do a new way of doing fitness programs. Hey, we're going to do a newsletter. And so I just shared mine. And the data was promising. It was like, okay, 90% of the people, 9 out of 10 people actually showed up every single day. But what's more is they did 35 texts on average a day to the group. And that was like really interesting. I was like, that's a lot of engagement. I don't know if I text 35 times in a day. I guess I'm a terrible texter, but I don't know if I do that. And so to see that level of engagement was huge. So the team was like, this is crazy. And I was like, yeah, but it's only 10 people. And they're like, well, let's try another week and let's try it with the rest of the group. Let's all agree, all 5 of us, to run one group. So that's 50 people through it. End of the week comes, it's the same result. 90% of people and roughly in the 30 to 35 text per day range. We're just dumbfounded. We're like, oh my gosh, we may have found something. We've got some early market signals that we found something. So fast forward to the next couple weeks, and we were running hundreds of people through this. And my wife hated me because I was staying up till midnight every night, managing it off of a spreadsheet, waiting till midnight to tell who the winner was. People were literally staying up till midnight to win this thing. It was crazy. And so the cool thing through this experience too is we actually got the opportunity because we could learn so fast. And what I mean by that is a couple weeks in, we said, you know what? What if we just tried to up the ante? What if we just tried to increase the engagement? So because we were running it manually week to week, we could actually do new things. So like one week we said, well, let's just see if we can release crazy challenges. I'm going to try and toy around with crazy challenges. So I was like, all right, you get bonus points for doing push-ups in a crazy place. People were doing it around their cars. They were doing it on the roof. They were doing it in the airport. It was nuts. It was crazy. We had to put disclaimers. It's like, hey, don't do it on the roof. We're held liable. And so all these crazy things were happening. And so, but we noticed when we were running the experiments, like, okay, that's one experiment that bumped up engagement. What about, let's try just moderating a little bit better. What if we said, red team pulled ahead, blue team pulled ahead, increased engagement? What if we allowed the teams to name themselves? And in fact, I'm not even going to say we came up with that. In fact, we saw it as a pattern that teams would give themselves names. We didn't even do that. It was the groups. Like we saw the group dynamic, and because we were so close to the customers and to the groups, we could see what they were doing and what they wanted, and we would change and cater the experience and roll it out to other groups. But because we did it all over text, the interesting thing was we weren't worried about things like bugs. We weren't worried about things like what features do they want? Because honestly, it was text. The world was their oyster. They could do anything they wanted, right? They were more worried about the experience and having a great experience than actually worried about what the end issue is of a bug if it was an app. So where we really started to pivot was, I'll get to the end of my story here, is we had something amazing. And what ended up happening is when we had a couple hundred people running through, we could no longer do it manually. So started to talk to some folks. We had a close connection to a executive over at Broadband, which is basically undergirding Twilio's platform, which sends texts programmatically for those that don't know and helps developers do that. And we didn't want to build an app because taking it out of texts, we felt kind of nervous. It's like changing a lot if you're doing that. And so they said, yeah. I was like, it's so expensive. We were doing text programmatically. We're doing it manually. And so I have unlimited text on my phone. Group text was just easy. But when we started doing it programmatically, the costs looked really pricey. The executive at Broadband was like, yeah, there's no way around it. I can't really give you discounts or anything. It's going to be kind of pricey. And so what we did is I went to Best Buy and I literally bought 15 phones, being an engineer, and I hacked all 15 phones to where all the texts would send through these phones. I'm not kidding you. So I would actually automate it to where it looks like it's coming from these phones and these phone numbers in order to send out these thousands of texts. So at the end of the month, I'm not exaggerating, I believe we're around 90 to 150,000 texts sent in a month. So that worked for a month. And then we got a cease and desist letter from Verizon, in which they said, yeah, there's no human way that this could have sent from one cell phone or a couple cell phones, so we're gonna shut you down, you're doing something shady, and they shut us down. And so they gave us 30 days, that was kind of them, before they shut us down, and we looked at each other and we're like, what are we gonna do? And at that moment, we decided we're gonna move over to an app, and long story made short, the next 6 months was a slog of trying to get users from text over to a very overpopulated app ecosystem, right? They have to download an app. After they download an app, it doesn't work for my phone because there's different versions of phones. It doesn't work for Android, iOS issues. Now people were more emailing us about bugs and issues than they were about the experience itself. And I share that story because too many people leap over all of that awesome first experience of a couple users and go right to this endpoint. And usually when they go right to the endpoint of building something, they don't have any users, number one. But when they do, they're more concentrating on all of the engineering baggage that brings with it. So you can see how we moved from 6 months down to 1 week. That's why we have MVS. So what I want to talk about is the cost of time. So through that experience in Silicon Valley, we really talk about an MVS being done, and it could be done in 3 months, versus that took 3 years for us to figure that out. And so imagine if you could have found product market fit in 3 months versus 3 years. And so for those that don't know what product market fit is, product market fit means being in a good market with a product that can satisfy that market. So that is a quote from Mark Andreessen, who's a venture capitalist. Another way of looking at it is, if you've heard of hockey stick growth, is the hockey stick has a gradual increase, and all of a sudden there's a moment that it just shoots right up, right? And at that moment, at the very bottom of that shoot up moment, that is product market fit, where you figured out the right set of ingredients. And I was mentioning to you guys about when we're doing texting, we believe we found product market fit. Now, we couldn't get to scale. That was the issue then at that point, but we believe we found product market fit, and you know what it feels like too. If you talk to people that have found product market fit in something, another way of using it is, or describing it is, oftentimes building startups feels like you're riding a bike uphill. Like, how many of you guys feel like you're riding a bike uphill, right? If you're, yeah. As innovators, sometimes you feel like you're riding a bike uphill and you're like, oh, this is so painful. Well, when you hit the right combination of things, it feels like you're going downhill. Like, people are coming to you because they want what you have, and they're asking to pay for it, pulling out their wallets, pulling out what they're saying, hey, I need this. How can I get it? That is product market fit. And so with corporate innovators, we talk a lot about not only product market fit, we talk about product market org fit. So how many people are in corporate setting? Okay, like half of you guys. That's great, because that's what we do. We work on the corporate side. And so the org, you guys can, I'm probably going to see some head nods here. The org side is a big part, because when you're talking in a corporation, you're talking about, is the organization ready for this type of new innovation, right? The organization, when you grow as an organization, you start going into what I call scale mode. And when you go into scale mode, you just operate differently. And so you start to optimize and you start to systematize, you start to protect what your main business is, so the cash cow, at all costs. And you start to look at these innovations, like opportunities outside of that, as distractions rightfully so, and you need to you start saying no to a heck of a lot more things. And because of that, that ends up being problematic when you're trying to create something new. And so how do you create an environment in a corporate setting for a venture to thrive? That is really the org component of product market org fit. So going back to the biggest misstep, the biggest misstep that entrepreneurs, corporate innovators make is they say, to recap, is they say, I'm going all in, right? If you look at this as chips, you got, $500,000 of investment. They make one very large bet on an MVP, right? One. And so you typically, when you do this and you have 6 months, you can only do 1 or 2 shots of this and you're screwed, right? And that's hugely problematic. So when we're talking about the better approach, we're talking about how am I going to take small bets and learn what works, right? Because if I have only 2 bets that I can make, my chances, if you even go to a casino and you have 2 bets, the chances of you getting something back as a return on any of that, horrible. But if you had 20 bets, 30 bets, 50 bets, your chances go up infinitely better, right? Of having something hit, at least one small percentage. So that's why we talk about basically, instead of doing 2 large bets, 3 large bets, you should just do a lot of small bets. So a good way to visualize this too is if you look at MVP, that's why we reframed it as different things. 6 months to 12 months, that's an MVP, right? That's the first version of a piece of software. We're leaning into that definition now. MVSs, you really, if you can see here, you can fit 5 to 10 MVSs for the same cost as one MVP. Right? You're able to learn at a more rapid pace than you ever could building an MVP. And again, one of the things I want to pull from my story too is the amount of engineering at first that was used in that shared group text. Nothing, right? You heard no engineering, right? Until we got to the point where I hacked a bunch of Verizon phones. So no engineering, very little to no engineering, you're testing it out. So at City Innovations, quick plug here is what we do, we install what's called a venture and innovation operating system. And that's so that we'll have a year or 2 contract, but instead of building an MVP and saying, we're going to build one MVP over the next year, and it's going to be to one initiative, a lot of times corporations, they've got 50 ideas and well, which one should we do? The good news is that because of market experimentation, what we're talking about here, we can do with one of our minimum viable solutions, we can do 10, 15 of those for just one MVP. So that's where we can just learn so much better of which ones you should invest more in and which ones you should drop very quickly. So I want to talk a little bit about another case study that I worked on. So I'm a mentor at the University of Chicago. As mentioned to you, I was talking to a startup the other day. I also, in the last 12 months, have been talking with a lot of AI-based startups. One in particular stood out to me. And so they came to me and I was on the periphery. They invited me into their team as a coach. And they just said, can you just talk to us for, every other week just till we get our sea legs? Sure. So what they wanted to do, they said, we have this idea, we're a 5-person team. We want to build this app that is a B2B app. And so we already have a piece of software that's generating revenue. So it's funding our team. Great, that's awesome. They bootstrapped it. They then say that we want to add this piece of functionality that's opens new market opportunities for us. It's basically a new product. And so what they wanted to do at a high level is they wanted to allow a business to upload their data, and then it spits out a dashboard of recommendations. We're running AI over them. I was like, okay, well, how long is that going to take? I ask all these questions, right? How long is that going to take? How much is it going to cost? Well, it's going to be a 5-person team. It's going to take us a year, and plus contractors. It's also going to be a year to build. $1 million to build. That seems like a lot, right? So what I talked to them about instead was I said, okay, well, what if you instead were to have the customer, the business, still upload their data, but instead of going through this AI model, it just says, now processing your information, come back in 24 hours. So after that, what they do is the engineers manually would create this dashboard and then post it back up, for the next day for the customer. I was like, can we do that? They were like, yeah, well, all the engineers hemmed and hawed. They're like, well, that's not scalable, right? They went right to that's not scalable. That's just not going to work. What if we get 100 customers? We need to prepare for thousands. And it's like, well, let's worry about the first 10. There's this methodology at Citi we call 10, 100, 1,000. That's basically saying you don't worry about 100 or 1,000 before you worry about you have 10. And so worry about the first 10. And so we're building to learn. We're not building to scale. And so after I got them on board, they were able to pre-sell. That's the big thing about this too, is you're pre-selling your work and saying they put up the page to upload the data, the processing, they had the scripts ready to do it, to kind of help create this dashboard manually. After they did that, they landed one customer. They're like, okay, great, this is awesome. We sold a customer. Now what do we do? Do we build this thing? I'm like, no, you don't build it. Do it manually, like we talked about. So what happened was the customer uploaded their data. They created the dashboard. The next day, the customer came back to this dashboard and we're like, oh, this is really cool. Not what I expected though. I was expecting these things to be different. It was about probably 35 degrees off from what they originally thought. Well, the great thing is the next day they're like, yeah, well, how soon you can make those changes? We can make them tonight. So they were like, what? You're the fastest development team I've ever seen. And so they made the changes and that they learned, right? They sold the next customer, same thing. And that customer had the same thought, well, there's a little bit of changes. And so this pattern continued over the next 5-6 customers. But what it did was it funded the entire effort, the entire development effort, the $1 million build. But what's more, it didn't just fund it. It also provided a blueprint and roadmap of what exact features customers wanted, which they didn't have before, right? So they had assumptions is what they had, is they had assumptions on what the customer wanted. They said, we know what the customer wants. And so that's when huge problems come in, is when you start getting these assumptions and you're just going right to building something. So that's what an MVS can solve. So really another way of looking at this, and I want to talk about what's called, a lot of people, I want to take a quick detour. They talk about human-centered design and they go, we've talked about this for a long time, Josh. This is not anything new. It's kind of old. Well, what we're talking about is like we have a human-centered design maturity model. And what has been out in the marketplace for a while is you've got visual design on the far right. That was 20, 30 years ago. Everything had to look pretty. Then everyone started adding UX to their resume. All the designers did. They're like, I do UX as well. And so no one knew what it was until we all knew what it was. And now it's like, wow, you can create amazing experience. Well, then it started talking about, well, it's not just the product experience. Now it's the customer experience. Let's let's zoom out even more on the customer experience. That's helped the market tremendously. But what I tell people is this, as I say, customer experience really zooms out to the level of not just product, but you're talking about the customer journey, the customer perspective. It slices across so many all aspects of your business. But we've thought this is really deserving of its own, what's called business experience. And really, are you building the right business around things, right? Because what's important is you could design an amazing experience for a customer, but what happens if the thing you're designing is just fundamentally flawed? The business overall is flawed. And that's where business experience comes in. So really we're talking about, is it the right product, the right thing for the market? Is it solving a core aspirin problem enough to exist? Again, I want to re-emphasize, we're talking about building to learn, not to scale. And so I was mentioning this concept is not new, which is true. How many of you guys have read Lean Startup? Okay, a handful of you. And then Eric Ries was a student of Steve Blank. How many of you guys have read like Startup Owner's Manual? Okay, there's like one person that's read it. So really at a high level, they've established this way of building experiments if you haven't read it. And just like I talked about, smaller bets, knowing what to build, that's a high level, worth the read for sure. But what we noticed is that when these were being put together, there's an opportunity in the marketplace to where on one end of the spectrum, you've got Eric Ries that is just tremendous at storytelling. And he learned everything from his mentor, Steve Blank. And on the other hand, you've got this guy that is Steve Blank that is a professor. He has all these frameworks. It can get very academic very quickly. And so we thought there's an opportunity like right in the middle to develop a framework. We didn't find like a playbook for doing this. Like, what's the playbook? And so really that's where we can develop this market validation funnel. So it's a repeatable playbook by doing all of those things. And you notice minimum viable solution is at the bottom of the funnel. That's actually step 3. So we're talking actually about step 3 in our process, not step 1. So we first go through this funnel and actually help entrepreneurs understand their market, understand their model, create a hypothesis, do other market even lighter weight experiments than creating an MVS. An MVS is actually a bigger experiment. And so if you can create even smaller experiments, it's all about shrinking the time to learn, right? And that's really why we created it. Another way of looking at it is this came out of a desirability, viability, feasibility framework. How many of you guys have seen this kind of overlapping, Venn diagram of these 3 circles? Okay, yeah, a couple of you guys. So really talk about viability, desirability, feasibility is like, what is it worth? Do people want this? And so the market validation funnel is a framework for determining those three things. That's why there's three phases, right? That first part of the funnel, we actually help on the viability side, as minimum viable model, we help with the viability, goes down to desirability for minimum viable learnings. And then at the feasibility side, that's where we get to minimum viable solution. So they map up one-to-one with our funnel. So again, mentioning the parts of our funnel, minimum viable model, we do business modeling, we do validation, growth strategy. Here in this phase, it's a lot of customer discovery and it's a lot of hypothesis generation. So how many of you guys have heard of the business model canvas? Okay, great. So we have a derivative of that we actually use as a base. And so we put your entire business idea that's in your head on paper, single page, and we put it in a business model canvas. And then we do desk research around that to determine what's the competitive landscape, what does it look like, so we're knowledgeable as we're entering into the subject. The second thing we do is minimum viable learning. After we go do that, we actually go and do rapid, quick ways of learning and validating that business model we just put together, right? There's a bunch of assumptions baked into the model, so we identify those assumptions when we're first doing things, then we go create market experiments. These are even lighter weight things than minimum viable solution. So for us, we're doing things like, some of you might consider this A/B testing, but if you want to know what your product pricing should be, which is a later step in the journey, easily create a market experiment. So create 3 different landing pages and have 3 different ads, and then gauge the amount of clicks through an ad and gauge the amount of people that either pre-sign up, put their email address in on the landing pages. Then you have data to back up your assumptions of which pricing model is correct. Which one does the market want and would bear? And then we get to a minimum viable solution. And really what that is that's where we do what we just talked about, is we bootstrap the thing. We use low code, no code, and we growth hack our way to early adopters. This is really where we get the first 10, then the 100, and then sometimes even up to 1,000 on this MVS. So what I want to talk about too is, just pausing here for a second after we're talking about more of a kind of a MVS style of learning. How do you get into that mindset? And really, I was mentioning low code, no code. We have this great scale here that we like to use. Is on the left, you see it says no code. That is best. So literally you're using things like Google Sheets, Google Docs, Airtable, all the things you can just off the shelf get and use that, right? On the far right is like low code. We're talking about low code. So we actually have helped a couple startups like go to acquire.com, go to GitHub, use repositories that are open source. And so it's like, it's a little bit of code, but ideally not a lot, right? But really you want to do mostly no code to no code completely, right? And I want to give some quick example case studies because I think this is really important that I hit on this. So how many of you guys have heard of these companies that are on this slide? Yeah, everyone, right? Who hasn't heard of Airbnb, Uber, and Groupon? So the stories here, the quick stories, everyone's heard of who they are as companies, but not very many people have heard of their origin stories. So Airbnb, the way they started was everyone sees Airbnb.com and they go, this is like millions of users, right? Tons of people. I use Airbnb all the time. It started with them renting out their own apartment. Literally customer 1. And that was during the middle of a conference, all the hotels were full, and they're like, I wonder if I just rent my own apartment out. Worked. And then they started to recruit their friends and say, well, I'm doing this thing. I want to do an experiment. Would you mind renting out your own apartment, finding those that would be open to it for some extra cash? He recruited his friends. They did it. Then after that, they recruited their friends. And it kind of snowballed from there to where he was managing all of these properties on a spreadsheet with phone calls. No website, right? No website. And I say that because too many people just see Airbnb and they go, I need to go build that, right? If they have a competing idea, they need to go spend all this engineering effort when that's not what the origin story was, right? Uber, another great example. So everyone's like, oh yeah, well, we need to build, how many times I've heard, I want to be the Uber of this, right? Or I want to build a competitor to Uber. I can't tell you the number of companies I've talked to that have wanted to do that. And so telling the origin story, it started with a phone number. People would just text. It literally had a flyer that's like, you need to go somewhere, text this number. That's it. Like they would literally have to text the address to be like, I'm here at this location and come pick me up and I need to go here. And that's how it started. It didn't start as an app. It started as a phone number for people to text, right? And then Groupon, both of those stories are great stories because there's absolutely no code at the beginning of them. Groupon had a little bit of code. So this is a great story with a little bit of code. And how they started was a WordPress website, which for those of you that don't know WordPress, okay, how many people know WordPress? Okay, most people know WordPress. It's open source, it's free, it's also really easy to set up. Like over half the internet uses it. But it's like, it set it up to where they did one deal a day. Like imagine just doing one blog post a day. That's what Groupon did. They literally focused their efforts on partnering with restaurants in Chicago and put that one deal a day up on Groupon. And that was it. Nothing else, nothing fancy, a blog. You can even go to the Wayback Machine. For those of you that know Wayback Machine, yeah, go to the Wayback Machine. You can Google it if you don't know where it is. You can actually go to Groupon and look at their website when they first started, and you'll see what the blog looks like. I say all these things because like the tactics of these early stage things should be mostly no code, and they should be white glove, right? So what I mean by white glove is you should almost act as a service first and walking and hand-holding customers through so that you can better understand their needs, right? That should be a theme in this, right? There's too many people that want to get to scale, which if you get to scale, you're isolating yourselves from your users. The advantage of this early stage is you are so close to your customers and you understand what they want. And then another tactic is Wizard of Oz. I mentioned that Chicago-based startup, like that is building that AI-based startup. They had a business upload their data, all that story. That's Wizard of Oz because no one knew what's behind the curtain, right? It's a service business. No one knows behind the curtain. They think it's cool. They think it's automated. And then the last tactic here is, and there's many more tactics, as these are example of a few of them, is that Groupon, that piecemeal, right? Is like, I'm going to take WordPress, but they also took a bunch of add-ons and added onto it, right? So it's like, how can you piecemeal through, I'm going to take Google Sheets, mix it with Airtable, mix it with WordPress, and then I'm going to plug out my startup. So these are some tactics of how do you move more towards like mentality of building to learn and building for MVSs versus I need to go out and build a minimum viable product right away. I need to engineer it, right? That's the presentation. I want to leave you with that. The last slide here I want to talk a little bit about is Traction Lab. So with Traction Lab, I was mentioning this earlier in the presentation. We meet companies where they're at. We meet them whether they have many ideas, a single idea, no ideas, or they're built and launched. So here we meet with these 4 different ways. We actually start with where are they currently? We'll do an assessment. We'll kind of figure out, the directions of where they want to go and how we can help them get there. And then we help them drive it, right? We help them drive to get there. So with Traction Lab, this is the first step with every entrepreneur, whether you're a corporation or you're a startup, we come in and this is a free first step. So just letting you know, the first step is getting to engage with our Traction Lab. It's generally a Traction Lab assessment. We'll come in, we'll do a 1 to 2 hour with your team, and we'll actually help figure out some of this stuff, kind of score you. We actually have a Traction Lab report. It gives you like a FICO score, is what it does. So it gives you like a FICO score for your startup. Reach out, scan the QR code. We'd love to chat. All right, guys, thank you very much.